The meeting will reconvene. Representative Hollins. Oh, there she is.
Did you call me? Okay, sorry. I was talking, I'm sorry. Sorry, Representative Reimer. Okay, let me wrap my head around where I was. So, we haven't had the pleasure of working together before, but I am a lawyer, and I don't do criminal law, which is kind of unusual, I think, in this committee. So I don't get a chance to talk a lot about my experience, but what I did want to mention with regards to your bill, I did family law, right? So custodies, divorce, adoption, all of that stuff. And what I will say is, and what I'm concerned about is, in my experience, people use the lack of documentation for immigrants as a weapon. When a man has a child with a woman who is undocumented, he uses her status as a weapon against her for both domestic violence, for custody battles. Like, you can't go to the courts and ask for custody or ask for visitation, because if you do, I will have you deported. Similarly with financial extortion. So I don't know how much you know about family law, but sometimes you get child support dictated by the courts, but also people can come to agreements on their child support. And when you have people coming to agreements on their child support independent of the court, and one person is undocumented, it means that it can be wildly unfair because of the risk of deportation, the risk of being sent to ICE. And so when I look at this bill, and I know Representative Engen mentioned that it was only for violent offenders, but I'm looking at Section 2, which is not about violent offenders. It's simply about the state, any city or county official not allowed to withhold information from ICE. And so this is the situation in which I see this being a real issue, is when people want to go to court to make sure that they have visitation with their child, to make sure that they are paying a fair amount of child support, they're not able to do that anymore. And these are people who work within our system, who pay taxes, who are a part of our community, who are being told you cannot have access to your kids, you can't have access to your money because you are afraid. And somebody is using this to abuse you, whether it's legally or physically. So that's the one thing I wanted to highlight. And I don't know if you have an answer for me, but I'll pause right here to see if you have a response to that.
Representative Reimer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative. More or less, this would require, and at the federal level, the Trump administration has really talked about prioritizing violent offenders, right? And so what this bill tries to do is come in conjunction with the bipartisan legislation that happened in Congress, the Lake and Riley Act. And what I would just say is if there is not an active investigation on somebody, then there is no need to cooperate. It's not like the local government units or the family courts or any entity like that is under requirement to proactively proclaim we have an illegal immigrant here. This is talking about coming in accordance and being responsive to a federal government inquiry.
Representative Hollins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand what you're saying, but the reality is when people bring a case to court, regardless of what that court is, regardless of whether they have a case out on them, they still have to go to the courthouse, right? And they have to state, right, if their spouse says, my spouse is undocumented, or not spouse, I suppose, but my partner is undocumented, then that goes into a record, and it is known to the peace officers who stand guard in our court systems. It goes to the judge who is in that court system. It is information about, you say official, employee, criminal justice agency, peace officer, et cetera. There are a lot of people who would have that knowledge that then makes those individuals susceptible to immigration tactics. And so I hear what you're saying, and I think maybe there is a more delicate way to get at this, but as it stands, this bill really has deep concerns about that, and it means that people who are living in our cities, in our state, will not feel comfortable communicating their needs to the government agencies that their tax dollars pay for. The second question that I have is, I'm really concerned about healthcare for seniors. So I don't know if you have any seniors in your life, but I had a father-in-law who was diagnosed with ALS when I was in my last year of law school. And we had a whole host of people who provided care to him. And a lot of those people were immigrants. And so knowing that there is such a shortage of that care provided, I'm wondering how this bill anticipates dealing with the fact that there will be fewer people who will want to even participate in our employment sector, right? In a space that is really necessary, right? There was a Star Tribune article that says 17,000 job openings for Minnesota care professionals, and that really relies on immigrant populations. And so I'm wondering how you intend to deal with that, how our elderly and infirmed individuals will deal with not having that necessary care that they rely on every day.
Representative Reimer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And what I would say is, first and foremost, and your question is well heard, and not to make light of it, but don't rape, kill, or murder, or carjack someone, first and foremost. The second thing is, the state is not, in this piece of legislation, a proactive, again, they're not shouting the fact that we have undocumented immigrants who are doing our elder care right now. That would need to be initiated by the federal government, and the federal government, I think up to this point, has made pretty clear what their priorities are in terms of targeting violent offenders. So this bill is in conjunction with accommodating that.
Representative Hollins.
Sure, I just have one follow-up bit. So hearing you on the criminal aspect of it, but I again will direct you to Section 2, which is not regarding criminal aspects. That is regarding the cooperation of local law enforcement in whatever way they are, in whatever their capacity is with ICE. So maybe somebody is just applying for a background check. Maybe somebody is applying to a government agency or trying to get a job that is within that is supplemented by, Medicare or Minnesota Care or something like that. If they find out this person is not documented, your bill is saying they must cooperate with ICE. They must report this person. So that doesn't have anything to do with their criminal background. That just has to do with them being a person who is an immigrant who is undocumented, and that's where my concern lies. Thank you.
Representative Reimer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Noted and appreciate the comments and questions.
Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Representative Reimer. Of course. Just one of the things that we see in our line of work, and I think maybe the folks on the law enforcement side do this as well or have done this in the past, but for example, when we started seeing a bunch of overdose deaths in our community.
A bunch of what?
Overdose.
Oh,
sorry.
Overdose
deaths, right? Heroin, it'll come in waves, and we were seeing a huge impact on it. And what our agency did is, instead of saying, look, if we come to your house and you have heroin or used heroin, we're going to arrest you. They said, if somebody is having an emergency and you call us, we have Narcan. We are not going to arrest you. They know that if the thought is that they are going to get arrested, people won't call. They will try and deal with it on their own. They'll try to find some other thing, and people get hurt because of it. So I know that the Sheriff's Association said they have concerns, and I'm still trying to do my due diligence and read a lot of the information that we get. And concerns, generally, it seems like the Minnesota nice way of saying opposed to. It's like the softer way of being opposed to something. And so just for the record, what the Sheriff's Association said is, House File 16 raises several legal concerns, particularly as it relates to due process and equal protection. In addition, the broad reporting requirements increase the risk of civil rights violations and may expose counties to lawsuits, with costs having to be covered by property taxes and levies. These legal concerns are more detailed in an accompanying Minnesota County Attorneys Association letter Lastly, mandatory reporting of arrests regardless of prosecution decisions may discourage immigrant communities from reporting crimes or cooperating with law enforcement, ultimately undermining public safety. So how do you respond to those concerns from the Sheriff's Association and how this is going to impact their ability to do their jobs in the communities that they serve?
Representative Reimer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative. And I don't know every letter that you got in there, but there are a number of those groups that I've had conversations with and talked through the concerns in regards to the 14th Amendment and making sure that you have due process, which all people are guaranteed, whether or not you are documented or undocumented in the country. This ICE, federal authorities are still beholden to the 14th Amendment. That new burden is not placed on our local law enforcement because that respect is still maintained at the federal level. ICE is still beholden to the 14th Amendment and individual rights, and to the extent that people would be scared to report crimes and things of that nature, I think the two things to keep in mind is ICE would need a reason, and again, the Trump administration, federal government has said they are prioritizing violent criminals, offenders, drug dealers, et cetera. They would need a reason to open up an investigation, and on the side of this bill, which talks about our law enforcement reporting that crime, there is a very narrow set of crimes that you need to be suspected of in order to be reported. What I would just caution, what I would just say, and I think, I don't mind being called this or that, but I think our rhetoric also has something to do with this as well. Should this bill become law, it's making sure that we try to keep the narrow focus in our rhetoric and how we talk about this, because we had a bunch of really talented, articulate testifiers come up here and give me personally a lot to think about, frankly. But what I also heard was a lot of things that were straying, I think, outside the purview of this particular bill. The conflation of legal and illegal immigrants, their contributions to society, and I get why that might have some broader context, but I also think the way that we talk about legislation like this, I'm always open to feedback, but I think that plays into some of your concerns.
Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick follow-up comment. A lot of folks that are in those marginalized communities are fearful as it is, and this adds another layer that will impact their willingness to call and ask for help, which means that more people in our communities, regardless of their status, are going to be suffering and potentially being put in more harm's way than if this bill becomes law. So it is a reality. It's something that we deal with all the time. Is we have to be trusted as firefighters, as EMTs, as law enforcement. You have to be trusted by the community that you serve, and this runs contrary to the ability to form and maintain that trust in those relationships. And I'll leave it at that.
Representative Reimer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nothing.
Representative Byrd.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Reimer, for bringing this. One thing you'll learn, it was something I had to come to terms with, is sometimes in this work, we think we're doing a really good thing, and it ends up having unintended consequences. And it's okay that that happens, and it's okay to go back to work on it and make it better. My concern with this bill, and we heard a number of testifiers talk about it, we have a number of letters here, is how this impacts victims. And Representative Johnson talked about the trust that is needed within the community for law enforcement to ask for help, and that's one piece of it. And I don't know if you all recall, this was a couple of years ago. There was a woman on a construction site, and we've heard today about the human trafficking that happens within labor and the construction industry. What goes along with that is oftentimes sexual assault. So there was a woman who worked on a construction site, I think it was in St. Paul, who was raped on the job site. She was there to clean bathrooms in apartment buildings as they were being worked on, and she was raped in a bathtub in an apartment building. And she worked with the Carpenters Union and law enforcement to come forward and to talk about it. And I remember hearing her story that there was a event held on the Capitol steps where she stood there and told her story as an undocumented woman who was raped on the job site. That took an immense amount of trust that she wasn't going to face further consequences after going through this horrific assault. And just on March 3rd, they held a press conference. Attorney General Keith Ellison prosecuted Absolute Drywall because she trusted that she wasn't going to get deported, bringing to light what had happened to her. And that's one woman and one chance that we got to get it right. And we know that the labor brokers, that is what they hold over the head of their workers. First of all, they create that fear. They threaten, well, I'll go to law enforcement, I'll get you deported. The labor brokers know they're not going to go in law enforcement to face those consequences themselves, but they instill that fear to people that are new to the country, that are trying to send money home, that are trying to be an honest worker, right? And it can go in a lot of really terrible directions. And so the fact that this woman had the courage to bring her story forward is the exact reason a bill like this can be so damaging, and why you don't see story after story after story in the news, but I promise you it's happening. And I wish the woman that testified, I believe Ms. Lohman or something from one of our testifiers, was here to kind of expand upon it, because I just know this story through my work here. And I think that we don't need to rush into matching federal policy. We don't need to rush something like this, because the unintended consequences here can be really bad for a lot of the work that we're trying to do to bring to light the criminals that are doing this on the job sites. And that's just one piece of it. We heard victims talk about domestic violence, and there's no doubt your testifier's story is horrific. And we need to address something like that. But that's not the only story out there. That's not the only person affected. We're talking about entire communities. And so I just want to bring that to light, because we do have concrete stories of what good can happen when terrible things happen to people, but it's only if they can trust that they're not going to face worse or additional consequences when coming forward to shed light on really bad actors. And so once again, there is no shame in slowing it down, working on it a little, making sure that we're getting at what we want without impacting entire communities in ways that we may never regain the trust that they place in us. So no question, I just kind of wanted to give you an example of some of the things that we're trying not to do when we rush into legislation like this. Thank you.
Representative Reimer, response.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One thing I'll say is that I think we'll learn together, Representative Berg, the importance of balance, because it's the first time in this chamber that we've had balance since you were elected. There's a balance between the stories that you lay out and then the stories that we are presented with real victims that cause marginalized communities in particular. When you have a situation, a compounding situation of an undocumented immigrant, so we can all agree that if you're undocumented, it means that you came here without our knowledge, right? So there's that situation, and then that's compounded in what this bill is trying to address with the fact that you have committed a violent or heinous offense. Marginalized communities are as impacted by that, and for every story that you have talked about that doesn't make a headline, there is likely a story like America Thayer's story, or like the story where I think it was a year ago, where in Fridley, you know, an undocumented illegal immigrant posed as a UPS driver and murdered a family of 3. Those are headlines, and he had committed, you know, he had been convicted of other crimes in the past, and we kept him here. Now, for every situation that you described, there's a situation that I described. And I'm happy as this thing works its way through. I'm happy to continue talking about it, but what I would just say is I think this addresses a real problem that actually disproportionately impacts marginalized communities when you keep a violent offender who doesn't need to be here or who shouldn't be here in the community. So that's what I'll say on that. Thank you.
Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Representative Reimer. I appreciate that you view this as a bill that protects victim survivors of violent crimes. I'll note that the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault disagrees with you. Violence Free Minnesota disagrees with you. The organizations that actually work with victim survivors feel that you're wrong. They disagree with you about this bill. I've worked for many years as a prosecutor specializing in gender violence. I actually was charged the case. I'm a co-chair of the case that sent longest case for sex trafficking sentence for that crime in Minnesota history. So I think I know what I say when I'm talking about these issues. And where I just recognize this is an interesting bill, because when you've got those victim survivor groups standing with our school boards associations and our League of Minnesota Cities and our Association of Minnesota Counties and county attorneys, League of Minnesota Cities, heck, the Cato Institute, we've got the Sheriff's Association expressing significant concerns. It's just you brought a lot of groups out who all disagree with you. And I recognize that you've got your view, but those folks or professionals have a different view. And so one thing that confused me in what you're saying, you keep on referencing the fact that this is limited to people who've committed violent crimes. Can you just explain where that is in your bill? Because I'm confused about that. Because you were very clear that the only way somebody gets pulled into this is if they're a rapist or a murderer. Can you just point that out to me?
Yeah, so the bill references Minnesota statute.
Representative Reimer.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative. Yeah, the bill represents or references violent crime is defined by Minnesota State Statute 624-172 subdivision 5.
Oh.
Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Representative Reimer, that confuses me. So first, that's only in Section 3 of the bill. So sections 1 and 2 are a lot broader. But even setting that aside, I mean, you brought this bill to us. You're spending a lot of time, and you seem very confident about your protecting a victim. So you would know that, including a crime of violence, is somebody who possesses a tiny amount of methamphetamine. That's it. That is a crime of violence felony crime of violence under 624-712 subdivision 5. So that's a group that you do want included in your bill in Section 3, is that right? And many other crimes as well, but it includes all drug crimes under Chapter 152. I'm assuming that you know that since you're bringing this to us. And that's a group that you want included in your Section 3 of your bill?
Representative Reimer.
Mr. Chair, thank you. If they're dealing methamphetamine, then yes.
Mr. Chair?
Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Representative Reimer, no, it's drug possession. And so let's actually, and again, there's a lot of problems with 1 and 2, but let's just go to Section 3. And if you have it in front of you, yeah, please do. And if folks can do that, go to line 3.22. Because just this one sentence from 3.22 to 3.24, it's a pretty simple sentence. But I think if we just unpack it, we will see just one aspect of how this bill does not make any sense. So when a peace officer arrests an undocumented person on suspicion of committing a crime of violence, we talked about what that is, county attorney has to report the person to ICE. So let's just pause for a second. We've got a lot of law enforcement officers former around the table. So peace officer does a traffic stop, common situation, discovers a dime bag. There's some drugs in the bag, right? And they make an arrest. Person sitting in the squad car. So under your bill, what happens next? Oh, and sorry, let's say this too. In the squad car, and the county attorney, and let's say, by the way, the case is not presented for charging. Actually, let's just make this real simple. They figure out a little while later that the stuff in the bag is sugar. It's not drugs. Person was arrested, though. Person was arrested. So explain to me sort of what the steps are about how this works at that point. Because I want to point out, there's no discretion here. An arrest happened. So the county attorney has to report an undocumented person. I didn't say the person's undocumented, mind you. I didn't say they're documented. We got a peace officer who's like responding to, crimes, right? They're doing their job. They got to run off to the next call, and next call, and next call. So how does this work? Can you just explain to me how that happens? After the arrest, turns out to be sugar, they're going to release the person, but now an arrest was made. Walk us through how that works. And by the way, the county attorney wouldn't have known any of this, but in your bill now suddenly the county attorney has to get involved. Walk us through how that works practically.
Representative Pinto, have you ever charged out a case where there wasn't a preliminary test of a NIC test?
Mr.
We're going to.
And Mr. Chair,
We can play whatabouts and things, but I really don't know of at least in my experience, anyone being charged with a felony and making a custodial arrest when there wasn't a preliminary roadside test done. So I'll go to the question, but I mean, it's just getting outrageous. Let Representative Reimer.
Mr. Chair, yeah, and it seems like Representative Pinto might have specific words for you too. But one thing I just want to say, and of note, it's been really interesting to hear some of what you're saying, a little bit of the testimony. We're increasingly getting into hypothetical situations that seem more and more outlandish is the way that I'll phrase it. This is a very practical bill, in my opinion, that outlines specifically the crimes that must be committed and cooperating with and bringing up. People kept saying, clouding, bringing us into accordance with the federal government so that we are working as a cohesive unit to get violent offenders out of our city or out of our communities. So I can't address your particular hypothetical because it's just that. We're talking about a lot of situational victims, a lot of hypothetical victims, but there are real victims that we have stories of and that many go unreported by people who are being kept here when they shouldn't be.
Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Chair and Representative Reimer. This bill, I will say, Mr. Chair and Representative Reimer, there are many, many cases that do not make it to me as a prosecutor because what happens is the arrest is made, the person is brought back, at least in St. Paul, actually, I guess in all the jurisdictions I work in, there is a NIC test that's done not at the scene. I guess with the, even with the troopers, actually, the troopers probably not either. The NIC test is done later, right? So an arrest happens, there's a test that's done, and I certainly have cases where the test is done and it turns out that it's inconclusive, it can't be shown that that's what the drug is and the person gets released. This bill, look at line 3.22, is where there's a suspicion of committing a crime of violence. Suspicion, that's all that there is. The case never makes it to the county attorney, but under your bill, the county attorney has to be informed. This is the reason that our state's county attorneys have come out in firm opposition. They aren't just concerned, they are opposed to the bill. There's a reason that they are saying that. And in fact, it's a suspicion that says all that is required. I want to point out, Representative Reimer, I'd like to your response to this, because this hadn't occurred to me at first. I looked at it and realized, absolutely, the letter from the Hennepin County Attorney's Office pointing out that violent offenders will, in fact, use this as a weapon. There's been a general reference to this by other colleagues in their questions to you. But I think specifically, if you're on trial, right, in fact, for rape or murder, you just happen to be documented, you happen to be a U.S. citizen, and what you decide to do is, and your victim is undocumented, well, of course you're gonna say that they got drugs on them. Maybe you'll even plant something on them. Boom, off they go. So that's a piece of it being, people being less safe. So explain how Section 3, and we're only talking about Section 3, not the other problems. How would Section 3 not be used as a weapon in the manner that is described by the Hennepin County Attorney's Office?
Representative Reimer.
Thank you, Chair. Again, Representative, I think we're getting into a lot of different hypothetical situations. I don't know how to specifically address what you have just laid out step by step and how that would specifically work out. But I do find that we're escalating in terms of the hypothetical situational things that we're laying out for what I believe is a pretty simple bill.
Mr. Chair?
Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, Representative Reimer, welcome to criminal law. This is how it is. I can tell you I've tried many violent people in trials, gotten them convicted, had some times that I didn't. I went at it really hard on behalf of victim survivors. These are real situations. And I can tell you in my outside job as a prosecutor, I'm seeing body cameras, I'm reading reports, this is actual stuff. This is not, fancy in the cloud stuff. This is actual stuff in terms of how this will work. There is a reason the county attorneys have come out against this. There's a reason that the sheriff has expressed concern and all the other concerns. And I guess, Chair, I'll just, well, let me just ask this. How would this impact T and U visas, if I can ask that? And how would be the interaction between this and T and U visas for those victims of crimes?
Representative Reimer.
Did you, Mr. Chair, thank you. So T and U visas, I'm not in particularly sure. One thing I just wanted to take this moment to address, because I think it might also answer Representative Feist's question from before, was I did try to do a little bit of rapid research over the last hour to just try to address maybe what you brought up, and maybe this is covered under TUV visas as well. But the language of acquiescences is also found in 256L.04 subdivision 10. So that kind of defines acquiescences. I'm not sure if this, I'm not sure if this specifically represents your issue either, so.
And Chair, I'm not sure what
Representative Pinto.
I'm not sure what acquiescence is, what Representative Reimer is referring to. My apologies. I maybe was an earlier question or something. I don't recall the word acquiescences.
Yep.
Which doesn't seem like a word actually, but maybe it is. Can you maybe explain, maybe Representative Reimer, Mr. Chair, can just explain what he's referencing and also just answer what sounds like you said you're not familiar with T and U visas. For page 4, oh, thanks. 4.7, my colleagues are pointing out. Yeah, that may be something for Representative Feist, may be able to provide some expertise if she's able, Mr. Chair.
Actually, Representative Pinto, if you could, I know you're getting very passionate here, but if you could just slow down a little bit, because it sounded to me like a couple of minutes ago you said that cops are planting evidence on people?
No,
Okay,
no,
'cause
not at all.
Okay, if
Mr.
you could
Chair,
just
yeah.
slow down. I know you're getting
Absolutely, Mr.
passionate.
Chair,
This is
absolutely
something that
not.
you're highly involved in, but
No, I was talking about abusers, Mr. Chair, people who are in the middle of a felony trial, that an abuser would do this against their victim. Absolutely not saying that about our law enforcement officers. I'm talking about abusers, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I want to make sure that's clear.
hard to keep up.
Sorry, and I'm a
Could have been an actioner.
fast talker, Mr. Chair. My
Thank you.
apologies.
Representative Pinto.
Thank you. Well, maybe I think Representative Feist may be able to clarify this issue about the visas and the acquiescence, if that's okay, Chair.
Representative Feist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I promise I'll keep it short. And so that doesn't address my concern. So the issue is that immigration law is administered by numerous agencies that play different roles for different types of lawful non-immigrant visas. And so many people can be present in the United States legally, but have never filed anything with the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And I think Representative Pinto's question about UNT visas relates to the fact that immigrant victims of crimes can go to law enforcement under federal law, and if the law enforcement agrees with them that they have collaborated in the investigation or prosecution of that crime, they can give them a document called a U or a T visa certification. And just to take a step back, U visas are for immigrant victims of serious crimes that are enumerated under federal law, and T visas are for victims of trafficking. And so as part of that process, they can then get legal immigration status. And the point of the U and the T visa being created was to encourage immigrant victims of crimes and immigrant witnesses to crimes to collaborate with law enforcement and to seek help. And so I think the concern is that U and T visa eligible immigrants are not going to feel like they are safe to seek that help to serve as a witness. And we're just curious, what guarantees are immigrants going to have about the privacy of that data?
Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and I'll be wrapping up. It sounds like there was a question from Representative Feist to Representative Reimer, but then I'll have just
Well,
a
can I
final
answer
comment.
that question? Or it seemed like an extension of your question, right?
Representative, hold on.
And so, Mr. Chair, yeah, I was asking if Representative Reimer sounds like he wants to answer Representative Feist's question. I was going to step back from that, and then I'll just have one final piece, and then I'll be done, Mr. Chair.
Representative Reimer.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both for the tag team question, I think. This bill doesn't specifically address that, take anything away from that, et cetera.
Representative Pinto.
Thank you,
we'll be
Mr.
back
Chair.
to
So,
you.
so then wrapping up, I think, Representative Reimer, the concern is that those groups that work with victim survivors, not just the ones I mentioned before, Advocates for Human Rights, The Link, these are groups that I've worked with closely in anti-trafficking work, and there is a deep concern that they express and that I share on behalf of victim survivors of human trafficking and of sexual violence and of violent crimes. It's ironic that the bill is being brought forward purportedly on behalf of people experiencing those crimes, and yet in fact, people who work closely with those folks saying, no, it's just the opposite. And so I guess just this final point I want to make is that the bill is in fact so much broader than been referenced. I was focused on Section 3, but noting that those other sections apply to all undocumented immigrants. They apply, Section 2, as I read it, applies not just to public safety officials, it's any public employees. It applies to schools. It applies to any kind of public services of any kind, adding to the fear and the concern expressed by all these different groups. And I guess you had said, well, the Trump administration is focused on, you specifically said focused on violent criminals. The president has made very clear repeatedly, right, his intent to deport all undocumented immigrants. This was something that was a strong campaign plank, right, the largest deportation in our country's history. So I don't think that it would be a good idea for any of us to not take the president's words seriously when he says that in fact that is the goal. And so I don't think we should be reading your bill as, oh, it's just aimed at this particular group. The federal government has made very clear it's everybody. That's what they're saying. And if you think that this bill is a good idea for everybody, then I guess I would ask you to please be upfront and honest about that actually being what the situation is, because based on what President Trump wants to do, that is what your bill would be involved in. Thank you, Chair.
Representative Reimer.
Thank you, Chair. Nothing further. Thank you.
Representative Greenman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Representative Reimer, I think you've repeated a few times, and just sort of picking up where Representative Pinto left off, but that the Trump administration's priorities right now that he's articulating are going after violent criminals. Would you be advancing this bill if the Trump administration's immigration policy priorities were broader and were just targeting all immigrants for mass deportation?
Representative Reimer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative, this bill was really born out of the Lake and Riley Act, again, which got bipartisan support in Congress. You know, the November election was in large part adjudicated because people really cared about the strength of our border and making sure that we are actually taking seriously immigration. We did have one testifier who talked about Mr. Thayer's situation, who seemed very legally astute, but talked about how this was a perfect storm to create this victim. But what I worry about is how many perfect storms are occurring in our currently broken system. This bill, and I can only control my bill, the decision that I've made with this bill, is to focus on violent offenders and bring us in accordance with, should federal immigration authorities see a reason that a violent offender is in our community, we should have law enforcement, local law enforcement cooperating with them. That's all I can say.
Representative Greenman.
Thank you, Chair Navani. I didn't hear an answer. And I guess here's why it matters. There's a 10th Amendment principle called commandeering that says the federal government can't commandeer state resources, local resources to do their work like local law enforcement. We have that constitutional principle. And my concern with this bill, especially tacking it to, frankly, any policy position of the president, particularly one that seems to shift all the time, but any policy position, whether you support that president or not, is that what this bill does is commandeer to a certain degree and say that state and local resources will be facilitating that federal policy, regardless of who that president is. And so it really matters, the question I asked, which is, would you still be advancing this bill if the policy that you have articulated, again, and focused a lot on violent crime, which I want to talk about because we've talked about helping and ensuring that we are keeping our community safe. My city came up, and I want to get to that in a second. But before we get there, I just want to be really clear that if if you are hanging this on the idea that the current president has said their immigration policy priorities are violent criminals, that could change in a minute, and the commandeering won't change. And so I guess I'd ask again, and maybe I'll ask it a different way so I can get a yes or no answer, but would you be advancing this bill if the president of any administration had a policy that was targeting all immigrants for deportation?
Representative Reimer, would you like to respond to the same question again?
Or answer it?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What I can say is that this bill targets violent offenders. That is what this bill is designed to do. Again, it has been my understanding that both the Lake and Riley Act and what the Trump administration has said thus far is that they are prioritizing drugs pouring across our border, violent offenders, and making sure that our communities are safe. I can't answer a bunch of hypotheticals that keep getting brought up in this committee.
Representative Greenman, do you have a different question?
Thank you. I do. Thank you, Chair Novotny. And that's our job here, is to govern not just for the 7 anecdotes that we bring, but our job is to pass laws that affect the general public. In this case, we are passing a law that will say that state and local resources will go to implement federal policy. And so today, that may be one thing, tomorrow it'll be another. But as you said, this bill and all you can control is my bill. But this bill doesn't hold on to control for those policy priorities in the state. It gives those policy priorities over to federal decision makers. And that's a concern for me here in Minnesota. I guess the second question I'd have is, in addition to the state federal question, there is a state-local question. And we hear a lot in other committees, and I know you're new to the legislature, but I will say I have heard a lot in my 4 years here about local control, about mandates, about one-size-fits-all. And to me, that's what this bill does. It creates, it's preemption, but it creates a mandate that eliminates local control, has a one-size-fits-all, and says Minneapolis and Waconia, I'm just sort of the first thing that comes to me at the end of the alphabet, have to have this, that their law enforcement have to have the same set of policies and priorities, which are set to a certain degree by the federal government. And so I guess my question on local control is, you know, we have, and I won't bore you with, I pulled up the Minnesota House Research state-local relations, but our policy, you know, the Dillon's rule and all the things that modify it. But we do have, the way that we have structured our laws is to have a broad grant of authority from the state to locals to exercise, and I quote, any power not enumerated specifically to contribute to the protection of health, morals, peace, other good order of community, to promote welfare and trade, commerce, manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. And we have always known in this committee, we hear a lot from local law enforcement, from sheriffs, from police departments, from public safety commissioners about the individual needs of those localities. And I'm wondering if you think that the policy priorities of Minneapolis and the policy priorities of Minnesota should be the same as mandated by state law.
Representative Reimer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In earnest, I'm not sure that could you ask the question a different way? I'm not sure that I understand the question.
I can ask
Representative Greenman.
Thank you. I can ask it a different way. I guess I'm asking why you think local communities that have different challenges, different priorities under this bill that creates a one-size-fits-all approach to their relationship with federal priorities. I'm wondering why you think that that is an appropriate way for the state to govern, so that Minneapolis and Minnesota, and I'm just picking my state and another state that sounds like it, why you think that those two local jurisdictions should be treated the same under this bill.
Representative Reimer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative. I think the biggest reason is because we have had a number of local officials openly talk about defying federal orders. And I would just say, as a deterrent to violent crime, to emboldening criminals, a deterrent would not be saying that we are going to not work with federal immigration authorities at all. And yet we have a number of local politicians who are more than happy to use a political megaphone in order to amplify that message. I think this bill in particular helps send the message that we're going to keep communities safe. There's going to be a standard operating process for how we do this, and there's a very narrow focus on the crimes committed, that if you commit this crime, there should be the threat of us taking you out of here.
Representative Greenman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I heard law enforcement officers, I heard my public safety commissioner, I heard and see the Association of Minnesota Counties, the Minnesota Sheriff's Association, talk about the challenges as it relates to deterrence. You talked about deterrence. And what we know is the best deterrence is apprehension when we're talking about crimes. And what this does is say, instead of focusing on apprehending, charging, and prosecuting what is going to happen to our local law enforcement, and I have heard today, our local law enforcement, and I know other folks have said this, their law enforcement priorities, their apprehension priorities, their prosecution priorities with county attorneys are in service now of the civil act of ICE of our immigration system. To me, that's not deterrence, that's not public safety. To me, that is, you said a political megaphone, you talked about turning down the rhetoric. To me, you just said send a message. I think that this is not sending a message about public safety. I heard victims and prosecutors and folks say this is actually going to make it harder for victims to report and coordinate with law enforcement. I heard law enforcement say that this is going to make it harder because we're going to lose trust with folks in community. I heard almost every one of these letters raise concerns about that. And so what it feels like to me is not about keeping the residents of Minneapolis safe, the residents in Minnesota safe, thinking about violence prevention, thinking about how we fund after school care, all of those things that we spend the rest of this committee talking about. This feels like what it is it's about scapegoating communities, and it is about waving a political issue in front of our face. And so I hope that as we move forward, we talk about deterrence and apprehension. I hope as we move forward, we talk about things that we know are proven solutions. This is not one of them. The testimonies, including the Sheriff's Association, say it isn't. This creates a divide between communities and each other, but also communities and law enforcement, which is not going to keep my communities or all of our communities safe. And for that, I mean, this is a bill I'm looking forward to voting against. Thank you.
Response, Representative Reimer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Greenman, for your feedback.
Representative Ream.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I wanted to highlight a couple of concerns I have with this bill. I'm hearing from a number of members of my community that there's a real heightened sense of fear about bills like this. Parents are unable to take their kids to school now because they're afraid that they might get arrested, imprisoned, deported. I know what happened in Worthington a number of years ago really devastated the immigrant community down there. I have family members who are teachers down there, and they talked about how students left home, said goodbye to their parents, and they came back home, and their parents weren't home. They had been deported, or arrested at least. And so this is a real concern that I have is, you know, our children's well-being, education for our children, and just this heightened fear that people will have that, you know, anything they do could lead to an arrest and imprisonment, deportation. So that's one of my big concerns. Another concern I have is, you know, the economy in Minnesota. You know, we're dealing with a lot of uncertainties. You know, a lot is coming from the federal government with the tariffs that will raise prices, the The stock market is plunging. And I know even, years ago, we talked about how, if we don't have an immigrant population working in the health sector, in the agricultural sector, we're really going to be hurting. And so David Beer, who's, part of the conservative Cato Institute, he testified before Congress that losing undocumented immigrants would crash local economies, create a death spiral of lost consumers, closed businesses, and declining tax revenue. Also, the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, they wrote something similar. They talked about the importance of immigration to Minnesota safety and well-being. And this is data from 2020, which is a few years ago, but it said immigrant households in the state paid $4.5 billion in taxes in 2019, $2 billion in state and local taxes, and $2.5 billion in federal taxes. These tax dollars help support public education, healthcare, and safety throughout the community. And I guess in 2023, those state taxes paid were up to $6.2 billion, so it's probably even more in 2025. So another article in the Star Tribune by Sean O'Neill with the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce on March 7th wrote, "The bottom line is clear. Immigration is not just a demographic trend, it's a powerful economic strategy. Minnesota's future, competitiveness, and innovation depend on it." So I guess mostly comments. I don't know if you want to respond, but I am concerned about this bill. I don't think it addresses the horrific murder that happened in Shakopee. I think we need to address domestic violence, certainly. I think that's something I'd love to focus on in this committee. But I am concerned about this bill and how it would affect the well-being and just the general overall feeling of safety in our communities.
Representative Reimer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative. I'd love to work with you on a future bill like that. So thank you for your comments.
Follow up? Representative Riem?
No. Thank you.
Representative Hudson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Reimer, for presenting this bill. I almost forgot what it was and what it does, because we've been talking about a lot of things that go well outside the scope of it. So just to reset the conversation, it's got 3 sections. Section 1 says that a government entity will provide information. Am I looking at the right? There we go. Sorry about that. Let me collect myself here for a second. So this is the impact of the expansive conversation that we've been having. Notwithstanding state or local, no government entity responsible authority within Minnesota may prohibit or in any way an official from receiving or transmitting Federal Immigration Agency data. So we're saying we're not going to prohibit the transmission of this data. Section 2 says that we're not going to allow government entities, local government entities, to specifically prohibit the ability of law enforcement to cooperate. Not saying we're mandating it, we're saying you can't prohibit it. And then Section 3, which was conflated with commandeering, merely says that the county attorney, in the event of arrest, is going to convey that information to ICE. Commandeering would be if we put this in the US code, right? It would be the United States telling Minnesota what Minnesota's subdivisions are going to do. That's not what this bill does. This is the Minnesota House of Representatives. We are deciding what our statute is going to be. There's been a lot of conversation today about community trust. When your first action on our soil is to violate our laws, to violate our sovereignty, to dismiss our ability to control our own country, our own borders, that's a violation of community trust. It's not a good basis upon which to build trust between people. And when you use that illegitimately acquired access to our residents in order to violate their rights, in order to commit crimes against them, violent crimes, that doesn't do very well towards building community trust. The issue here is not, the tension that's being caused in our communities is not as a result of us bringing this bill forward, of Representative Reimer bringing this bill forward to try to get violent criminals properly adjudicated through the immigration system and deported. The problem is that we have endured the violation of our laws, the violation of our sovereignty, to the tune of millions and millions of people. And we haven't enforced our laws. That's the source of this problem. 83% of US adults favor deporting violent criminal aliens, 83%. Now that's bipartisan. Perhaps not among elected officials, maybe the vast majority of nonprofits, service organizations, the type of people who come to testify in our committee hearings, they might not be part of that 83%, but the real American people are. They support this. They want us to protect our citizens. And when you've already violated our trust by breaking our immigration laws, and then you violate it again by committing a violent crime, I don't want you to feel safe when you've done those things. This idea that keeps being floated that you have some sort of right to feel safe after violating our sovereignty, violating our laws. No, I have a right to feel safe as a citizen of this country who isn't breaking the law. So does my neighbor, so do legal immigrants who've done it the right way and have gone through our process and abided by our laws. They have a right to feel safe from you. That's what this bill accomplishes, and I appreciate you for bringing it.
Lead Mueller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, when that started, I thought you were talking about colonization and how colonizers came and took lands from Native people. So I got thrown off for a minute by the beginning of that. I'll just say that undocumented folks include people who come to the border and claim asylum. That is legal under our immigration laws. So those are people who went to the border, claimed asylum, and then because our federal system takes so long and is messed up, maybe haven't had their hearings yet on that. But those people are considered undocumented for purposes of this bill. And what you're saying is that somehow that is horrible and illegal that they're coming here. So just want to make that clear. As has been said before with the tragic story that we heard about America, the woman who was tragically murdered, as we heard, this bill would not have changed that because that murderer was already on ICE's radar and he couldn't be deported to Cuba because they wouldn't take him back. And so again, that's a federal issue and maybe that did create a perfect storm, but that's not one you're solving with your bill here. I can also tell you, in all my years as a prosecutor, over 20 years now, I have prosecuted far more citizens than non-citizens for violent crimes. I think you had made a comment that said for every citizen that commits a crime, you're going to find a newspaper story about someone undocumented committing a crime. That's not true. It's not my experience as a prosecutor, both in Hennepin County and at the Attorney General's office representing counties in greater Minnesota. I think it's Representative Pinto's experience as well in Ramsey County, but it's also what the data tells us. As has been cited in this Cato Institute studies, it said illegal immigrants reduce crime rates by committing fewer crimes. More than a dozen studies have found that immigration, including illegal immigration, is associated with less crime. And in fact, illegal immigrants help solve crimes. More crimes will go unsolved if we eliminate incentives for these individuals to cooperate with law enforcement, such as U visas, or punish jurisdictions that prioritize community trust. I also heard, and I wasn't quite sure what you were referencing when you said there was a lot of rhetoric here, and I think you were talking about people coming and testifying about how this bill really does have a negative impact on their lives or the lives of the people that they are working with. What I'm thinking about when I hear rhetoric on immigration
is what the President of the United States has said. They're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs. That's rhetoric, that's untrue, and it's also harmed people as a result. He also talks frequently about people coming over from insane asylums. I think he's actually confused about what asylum is when you come here and claim asylum as an immigrant. So that's the rhetoric that I'm concerned about, and that's the rhetoric that actually means news reports every time, you know, there's an undocumented person that commits a violent crime. That gets reported. It gets reported probably a lot more frequently on the news than the crimes that citizens are committing. You had also indicated you hadn't read all the letters yet. I know a lot of them came in last night. There are a lot there. By my count, there are 28 letters that are posed or have concerns. Many of those letters have multiple organizations signing on. I saw only one letter of support for your bill. I'll note there was also an article from the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation is the architect of Project 2025, which says it wants to remove U and T visas for victims of crime. So it's more than just what the president has said or what you believe he said about only going after violent offenders, which actually we also know is not true. There's data from ICE that there are now 16% more people with no criminal charges who are being detained right now. So they are increasing people who don't have any criminal charges. There was a Star Tribune article about a man from Burnsville who was detained by, I think it was the Bloomington Police Department. He was pulled over driving after suspension, and it said in the article he had no criminal history. That man ended up in Houston. That's what that article was about. So I think that this bill is not ready. I think all of the experts who have come and testified and who have provided letters give all of the reasons why this bill is not ready, and I'm going to be voting no.
Representative Reimer, I'll just get my little closing and then you can have yours say. When we talk about rhetoric, we talk about the rhetoric that's coming from inside this committee, talking about nursing assistants and home care people, having a little bit of experience and working, spending a lot of time with someone that is in the care assist area. Do you have any idea how long it takes to get trained, certified, background checked? I don't think they're really who we're talking about here. You can, once again, we're going to go back to the sky is falling thing. That's not who we're talking about with this bill. This bill is a bill about making a law that says the laws have to be followed. It's just, we're not against and we're not looking for legal immigrants. They are not involved in this. They're the people that I welcome. I'm involved with someone. Okay, my wife works for a nursing organization. There's a statewide effort to recruit nurses from Kenya. Representative Noor from your party is leading this effort to bring in legal people that are going to provide this care for my parents. Maybe they'll be there when I'm in the nursing home someday. This is not what we're talking about. We're talking about people. You say they got here and they claimed asylum. It goes to what Representative Hudson said about they got here, they claimed asylum, so they're good until their hearing sometime 20 years from now because the courts are so flooded, and then they commit this crime of violence. They had their asylum status. Had they not committed this crime of violence, then they wouldn't be in the situation that they're in. It's a bill to make people follow the law. And I just want to point out, since we're naming our, presidential administration that you want, I was working the night of September 11th, 2001. I was the supervisor for the county, and I watched the black Suburbans take Zacharias, whatever is it, Musawi, out of our jail. He was part of the conspiracy. He would have been one of the people that would have been on a plane. I saw him go. Sherman County has become one of the main federal holding facilities. So I've seen and watched. I was in the jail working a lot with them during the Obama administration. And I Googled, because I had plenty of time during some of these questioning streams, how many people were deported. 2.5 million people were deported in the Obama administration. And those were all people that did things to bring attention to themselves. And you talked about due process. We had people that were, we had one high-profile case that was one of the biggest kiddie porn dealers that there was, and he still had his due process before he was deported. This is a bill that just says we should follow the law. None of this other stuff, not about who you get your shots from. Representative Reimer, close.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just keep it very brief. I want to just go back to our original introduction. This bill accomplishes two main things. The first is that mandates any illegal immigrant arrested on suspicion of a violent crime, even in cases when the county attorney elects not to prosecute, be reported to ICE. Second, this bill prevents state and local entities from actively prohibiting, restricting, or interfering with federal immigration authorities in carrying out federal immigration enforcement. A lot of information. Y'all are really good at what you do. My brain is spinning. The testifiers were really good, and I appreciate the questions, the feedback. I look forward to working with you all. I work both sides of the aisle on future issues. But what I will just say is that I feel like I heard a lot of, again, hypothetical situations which grew in complexity and outlandishness, and I understand that's a consideration, but this bill is very simple, and it goes back to keeping our communities safe. I ask for your yes vote today. Thank you.
I will renew my motion, recommend.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, we request a roll call. Thank you.
Renew my motion to recommend that House File 16 is re-referred to the Elections, Finance, and Government Operations Committee. A roll call has been called, and it will be granted. The clerk will take the roll.
Novotny,
Yes.
Whitty,
Yes.
Moeller,
No.
Berg,
No.
Bliss,
Yes.
Curran,
No.
Duran,
Yes.
Hengen,
Yes.
Feist,
No.
Greenman,
No.
Harder,
Yes.
Hollins,
No.
Hudson,
Yes.
Johnson,
No.
Pinto,
No.
Ream,
No.
Rapinski,
Yes.
Schwartz,
Yes.
Steer,
Yes.
With 10 ayes and 9 nays, the motion prevails, and House File 16 is re-referred to Elections and Government Operations.